Dr. Theodore Richards is a philosopher, poet, and novelist. He is the founder of the Chicago Wisdom Project, the editor of the online magazine Reimagining Education, Culture, World, and a board member of the Homebound Publications. He's also the author of multiple books, including Cosmosophia, Cosmology, Mysticism, and the Birth of a New Myth, which is the recipient of the Independent Publisher Awards Gold Medal in Religion and the Nautilus Book Awards Gold Medal. The title of Dr. Richards' keynote speech is The Climate, the Cage, and Coronavirus, Interconnected Crises and the Cosmology of Disconnection.
The Climate, the Cage, and Coronavirus, Interconnected Crises and the Cosmology of Disconnection. This conference is exploring the psychology of global crises. This phrase, I think, to many first hearing it, can be taken in two ways. First, we can look at the psychological toll of living in crisis. Indeed, many of us are depressed from quarantine. Others are anxiety-ridden from the climate crisis. And still others traumatized by war or economic pressures. Yet another way to look at the phrase is to think of the global crisis as merely psychological. In other words, it's all in your head. Change your mind state, the line of thinking goes, and it'll all be better. Both approaches have value and limitations. Rather than critiquing them individually, however, I will be critiquing the dichotomy itself. Not only is it false, it is the very cause of the crisis. For the notion that we can separate the interior psychological realm from the material, political, or social spheres is part and parcel of the dualisms of modern cosmology, of the walls we've constructed to separate ourselves from others or even to put others in cages, and ultimately the walls that have trapped us all in cages. This talk will consist of 4 parts. In part 1, from crises to crisis, I will discuss the myriad crises our planet faces at this moment and argue that they are best understood as a single interconnected crisis. In part 2, the inner climate, I will address the crisis as it is manifested in our interior lives, particularly in widespread cosmic loneliness. In part 3, the cosmology of disconnection, I will describe the cosmology that has gotten us here, especially as it is the product of the individualism of capitalism. In part 4, the one planet schoolhouse, I will offer alternatives to the cosmology of disconnection, focusing on the ways in which we learn and educate through metaphor, symbol, and story. Part 1, from crises to crisis. Making connections in a civilization rooted in building fences and drawing lines will always be a hard sell, so bear with me. I'm going to try to make sense of our moments, of the myriad crises in which we find ourselves, the many cages in which we are imprisoned. We've drawn these lines, built these walls as a way to take ownership, to control a strange and dangerous world. I want to try to better understand how we got here, how we built prisons, cages, walls around bodies and minds, so that perhaps we can see a way out. My purpose is not to analyze every crisis on the planet today. Rather, it is to describe how seemingly disparate crises are part of the same interconnected complex. In tracing the roots of these crises, we'll uncover not only that our crises are connected, but also that our inability to see this interconnection is actually a part of the crisis itself. We have constructed walls, real and psychic, and believe that there are crises, but there is only crisis, a single interconnected event that can be understood by uncovering the unspoken narratives beneath. Let's take a look at what's going on. We are confronted with a crisis, climate change, which threatens our very survival on Earth. Never before has humanity been so threatened, at least by a threat of our own making. So one could be forgiven for thinking that this crisis takes priority over all others. We cannot worry about our increasing economic disparities, the rise of fascism, or the loneliness of the digital age, because we can afford to focus on carbon outputs. This is how the logic goes. But it is this very mentality, the fragmentation of our world, the myopic focus on the quantifiable, that has caused the collapse. A closer look at what else is going on, reveals the interconnected nature of our planetary crisis. The global north is confronted everywhere with what has been termed the migrant crisis. Much has been made of the specifics of this unique manifestation of this global crisis. In their typically myopic and self-absorbed fashion, both Europe and the United States have focused primarily on how to manage their own borders, as if the crisis begins at the border. Beyond that, there's only been discussion about the specific geopolitical and economic conditions in the countries of departure. But again, this too fails to appreciate the broader context of the crisis. We have to take a step back. Looking at this globally, we can see a line of migration across the planet, from Central America to the Sahel to the Near East. Geopolitics and economics cannot be separated from the shrinking resources and droughts. The planet is changing. At the borders, there's only talk of walls and cages, but no wall can keep out the coming storms, rising tides of seas and people. In Implicit in these policies is the notion that one life is worth more than another. At the Mexico-US border, we are building walls and cages. In the Mediterranean, we are okay with drowning migrants. Those lives aren't worth as much as the ones to the north. It's absurd, in the United States anyway, to talk about rounding up migrants, separating families, and putting children in cages as un-American. This is a profoundly ahistorical view. The separation of peoples is foundational to the American project. After all, this is a nation built on slavery. Indeed, if we look at mass incarceration today, there's a lineage of white supremacy extending even beyond the founding of the nation. Moreover, we will see that the broader capitalist worldview, the cosmology of disconnection, requires these dualisms. But I like to go even further back, for I think that one of humanity's oldest texts, the Epic of Gilgamesh, is informative at this moment. Gilgamesh is a king, a tyrant even, the paradigmatic empire builder, a builder of a great wall around his city, Uruk. He's part man and part god, which makes him at once strong and perhaps surprisingly weak, for he cannot recognize the value of human connection, of friendship. He sees only power and seeks to build walls rather than relationships. So many thousands of years later, we know of such men, don't we? And still contemplate the wisdom of building walls. In response to this tyranny, the god sent Enkidu. He's part man, but his other half is animal, wild. The wild man becomes Gilgamesh's greatest rival and ultimately friend. He teaches Gilgamesh the joys and sorrows of human friendship. But as he helps Gilgamesh become more human, Enkidu enters into the world of human civilization. He loses some of his wildness. Human civilization is still, even now, brand new. It is an experiment, really, that may or may not succeed. For most of human history, we were more Enkidu than Gilgamesh. The rise of large-scale agriculture, urbanization, and empires, the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia were among the first, radically altered human experience. We began to ask new questions. Immersed in the world of the forest, Enkidu would have seen the animals, plants, and clan were enduring, and through them he would find connection and meaning. But Gilgamesh seeks after a different kind of permanence. He wants to be remembered for his wall and his empire, and ultimately he asks, what is the fate of my own soul? Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu reject the goddess Ishtar and kill her bull. This rejection of nature, of wildness, and of the goddess leads us down the path of civilization, seeking to become more like the gods. In killing the goddess and entering into this urbanized imperial world, Gilgamesh and Enkidu are entering into a new kind of human consciousness. It is the world of patriarchy and of alienation from the natural world. In addition to the philosophical and spiritual dilemmas that come with it, there are also ecological and biological costs. Ishtar's revenge is to send a plague to kill Enkidu. This makes sense, for the people who wrote this story, like all people living in large civilizations, would have known disease. Enkidu is killed for becoming what we may call civilized, maybe more accurate to call it sterilized, just as so many of us have been killed by animal-borne diseases brought first by the agricultural revolution, and then later by the industrial revolution, cancer, heart disease, obesity. Today, we enter into a third phase of the diseases of civilization. AIDS, Ebola, SARS, and now coronavirus are diseases caused by the continued destruction of wild spaces. Although Gilgamesh has learned something from his friendship with Enkidu, his response to Enkidu's death shows that he's still a man struggling at the edge of the divine and human worlds. He goes on a final quest to find immortality. He fails ultimately and learns that he must honor his friend's memory by being more human. But this quest remains our quest. We still seem to want to be like gods, intent on forgetting what it means to be human. It turns out that humanity has been grappling with the same questions, the same struggle, since the earliest civilizations. The coronavirus pandemic can be understood as part of our continued rejection of our natural human nature, of our encroachment on the wild. We've deluded ourselves into thinking we are gods, separate from the wild and our own wildness. This separation is the actual cause, and this notion that we can control things to be gods is the very source of our paving over this world, is the source of the ecological destruction, of the biological and cultural monocultures that have rendered us so vulnerable. This is what empire does. It turns cultural diversity into globalization, diverse ecologies into monocultures. 4,000 years later, we are still building walls, still building empires, still rejecting the goddess, and we are still rejecting and repressing the wild person inside ourselves. Our walls are both literal and figurative. We live today in lonely screen worlds of individualized consumerism. Each of us is a little Uruk unto ourselves. We are also little Gilgameshes, each of us seeking immortality, each of us always on some kind of quest, looking for something else. If nothing else, the restrictions of the global pandemic are teaching us to be still. Gilgamesh, the ancient poets ask, where are you hurrying to? We might have asked this of our entire species up to a few months ago, but we are not gods. We're merely animals who have learned to care for each other, like Enkidu. And like Gilgamesh, we must learn in these dark days to contemplate life and death, friendship and love. Our troubles just now have to do with walls. We built walls that we think can protect us. Like Gilgamesh, we think we can be gods. We are learning, like Enkidu, that we are mortal, and that sometimes the walls we build up end up enclosing us in cages. Indeed, the psychic walls are perhaps the highest. The inner climate crisis is as pervasive as the outer. Part 2, the inner climate. From the melting polar caps to violence in our cities to the rise of fascist governments, ours is an age in which we seem to be able to agree on almost nothing, except that we are in crisis. It would be easy to think of the rising anxiety I'm feeling as something different from the rising sea levels, or to think of the migrant crisis as at odds with the violence in our inner cities. But at the core, all of our crises are actually share the same roots, and part of the healing process individually involves getting to those roots collectively. I'm talking about the global crisis, but it isn't merely about the melting polar caps or CO2 levels or temperature. It isn't merely about economic disparities, racism, or sexism. It's about a climate of loneliness that has taken over the planet, a planet of shrinking resources, imagination, hope. But how can we be hopeful when news of our demise comes on the television every night? How can we learn to share our resources when we're told we can only find meaning by consuming more and more? Most significantly, how can we live as though the planet itself is a single, interconnected community when we've been told that our purpose is to find only individual success, only individual salvation? I'm going to suggest that our spiritual malaise, the loneliness and loss of meaning, is connected to our ecological, political, and economic crises. It's all connected, and it's all about the deep story we tell about who we are and our place in the world. Let me explain. There's something in the air as thick and unmistakable as the CO2 particulates, even if it isn't as easily quantified. All around us, there's an anxiety about our future, about the future of our children. And like climate change, the anxiety is so massive, so all-encompassing and consuming that it feels impossible to escape, impossible to deal with. We live in the age of anger, in an age of fear, but of all the emotions that dominate our age, I'm suggesting that loneliness is the most pervasive. It is loneliness that tortures the mass shooter or Wall Street executive who never seems to have enough. It is loneliness that leads us to addictions to shopping or food or anti-anxiety meds. In some ways, the subject of this section is my own greatest fear, and perhaps that which we all fear, being alone, really alone. It is a major struggle for people living alone in quarantine right now. I've often suggested that this is the ultimate salvation we're all seeking, true communion, connection, far more than any lonely, segregated paradise. Why are we lonely? The questions are complex and have to do with the habits and lifestyles of the modern world. We surround ourselves with less family and community. We spend more time staring at screens, but our loneliness begins with a story about who we are on the most fundamental level. This story tells us that our deepest identity is individual and that we need to buy our way into a meaningful life. This is the story of capitalism. Its deepest roots are found in the story of patriarchy, which is hinted at in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is the story that first suggested to us that we can strive to be gods, separate from nature. It seems that men are suffering and doing so much harm because of loneliness. It's literally killing us. The men I've known who've died recently before their time had one thing in common. They were all living alone. It's unmistakable how lonely we are. You can feel it in the crowds, among the masses of people ignoring one another, staring at their own privatized space in favor of the world. How is it that I can feel less lonely alone in my living room listening to Coltrane than on a crowded bus? This feeling reveals to us that loneliness isn't entirely about being alone, at least not the kind of loneliness I'm talking about. I'm referring more to the more than to the sadness of missing other people. I'm talking about a cosmic loneliness, a loneliness that is the product of a narrative that tells us that our ultimate identity is individual, that we are not, in fact, in this together. And we aren't just lacking in community with other people. We've lost our place in the family of beings, our ecological place. We've lost our intimacy with the earth, its rivers, its mountains, its seas, and the other species that make it up, that make us who we are. This requires us to experience the earth in intimacy, not just stare at screens and drive from one sterile, climate-controlled space to another. It requires us to feel the texture of our world again, to fall in love again. It has been well understood and documented that the climate crisis has taught us that we live on an interconnected planet. Decisions made on one continent can impact another. Less widely considered is the crisis of our inner climate. The inner climate is like the outer, interconnected. Our emotional lives are ecological webs, not isolated individuals. So if the inner life is made toxic by a toxic story, we become unbalanced. I don't need to use extreme examples like mass shooters or oil spills here. Just spend some time on Twitter or watch the plastic bags floating down your street. I'm suggesting that something even more profound in the realization that our ecosystems are interconnected. Our emotions are a part of the ecosystem and a part of the earth itself. And so, we must let go of the notion that loneliness, whether it's felt by the mass shooter or the person sitting in the cubicle next to you, addicted to his meds, is merely an individual psychological problem, a mental health issue. Loneliness, by its very nature, cannot be cured individually. It is a shared problem. It is a cultural problem, a problem of story. Part 3, the cosmology of disconnection. Think back to your earliest memories of childhood. If your childhood was like mine, you may recall curling up somewhere with a parent or another elder, listening to a story. Or perhaps you can recall attending a church or another place of worship, hearing the stories passed down through the generations. It was in these moments that you would have learned life's deepest and most important lessons. Through human touch, voice, and the magic of words, you began to put your own world together. You began to discover your own place in the world. There is nothing more quintessentially human than sharing a story. Before there were books or churches, there were human communities that had to figure out how to survive in a dangerous and uncertain world. Humans weren't as fast as the antelope or as strong as the elephant or sharp-toothed as the lion. Their special gift and skill was the ability to care for each other and work together to build community. And they did this through the magic and language of story. In spite of those early childhood memories, many of us often wonder why it is we don't simply act rationally in order to solve our problems. It's because any rational act is always performed in context, the unspoken, unseen story that lies behind our actions. If we have a story that tells us we are radically separate from the earth and from other people, and that our purpose is disembodied individual salvation, it is rational to ignore the impact of climate change. It is rational for a society to have extreme and growing economic disparities. It is rational to want to go on a trip to the beach rather than wait out the lockdown. The modern story is rooted in the emergence of colonialism and capitalism. In these systems, lines were drawn, both in maps and in the human imagination, to separate that which is valued and that which is considered a mere resource. Even other human beings could be exploited or enslaved in such a system. Forests were razed, lakes and rivers redirected and poisoned. The Protestant Reformation put an increased importance on the salvation of the individual and taught that prosperity was a sign of God's favor. What did it matter if we destroyed the earth, if we were just trying to leave it all behind in heaven anyway? We couldn't be blamed for exploiting workers if it was merely God's will, a sign of our favor and their condemnation, could we? Human beings gained a great deal of wealth and advanced technologically during this period, but it came at a great cost. We lost our place in the world. The capitalist system was based on individual self-interest and the generation of wealth through debt and growth. That is, wealth is generated by capital, a debt that is allowed with a belief in the perpetual growth of the economy. But this faith rests on certain assumptions. First, it required a radical dualism of ensouled individual and the world or nature. This included the othering of non-Western people. People were enslaved or exploited. Nature became privatized and exploited. This constant exploitation and colonization allowed for growth. Nowadays, as the planet approaches its limit and opportunities for colonial-style exploitation have decreased, growth is attained through a combination of privatization and intensified consumerism. In other words, turning public goods into private businesses, as in the US with schools and hospitals, and by getting people to buy things they don't even need. And how does one get a person to buy something they don't need? It turns out that the answer is similar to the way you convince them to pollute a river or exploit workers. You convince them that they're fundamentally alone. But you don't call it that. Instead, you call it freedom. You tell a good story, a good, compelling story to back it up. Let's look at recent mega protests against the economic lockdown. Coronavirus has exposed the fundamental interconnectedness of all humanity, but these protests for so-called freedom seek to reinforce the absolute sovereignty of the individual, the white American individual, of course. It has echoes of the slavers' protest against abolition, which was framed as an infringement on his individual property rights. If nothing else, coronavirus is teaching us that we're actually deeply interconnected. Even with all the measures to keep us apart, it's nearly impossible to disentangle ourselves. While the notion of seeing a more interconnected world may seem radical, it is actually consistent with human culture throughout most of history. All cultures have shared stories, myths, that reveal their core assumptions and values and help place the individual in relationship to the community, including the non-human ecological community. For millennia, small groups of humans lived in a story that allowed them to understand themselves as interrelated to their world and embedded in a web of ecological and social relationships. But things have changed. Part 4, the One Planet Schoolhouse. If the radical individualism of the capitalist cosmology is leading us to global crisis, manifested internally as loneliness, for example, or externally as fascism, climate change, or pandemic, then a deep reimagining of this story is required. It isn't as simple as any individual dictating a new story. Indeed, multiple viewpoints are required in order to bring forth this story. For among its characteristics is its multi-perspectival nature. So I don't claim to offer an entirely new cosmology. What it can offer instead are concepts that I believe can provide a context for shared inquiry. For lack of a better word, I refer to this as a classroom. For the classroom is one of the primary contexts for the cultivation of a cosmology. It isn't precisely the ideas or skills that are most important in the classroom. It is the way in which a classroom serves as a metaphor for the world, a microcosm. Years ago, I traveled around the world, across Asia overland, through North Africa and Europe, and back to Chicago. I learned many things along the way. Indeed, I encountered the poverty, polluted air, and shrinking resources that are part of the global crisis. But perhaps more than anything, I learned the reality of the singularity and interconnectedness of this planet, an island from which we cannot escape. Choices made by wealthy countries on one side of the planet were determining the lives of poor children on the other. We are stuck with each other, entangled in this immense planet we cannot escape. After my trip around the world, I went back to school studying the world's great mystical and mythological traditions. But I couldn't seem to get away from my roots as an educator on the margins. While in school in California, I teamed up with a teacher to co-create a program for teens. I learned from my travels and from my studies that the world's wisdom traditions all told their deepest truths, not in lists of rules or even concepts, but in the stories they tell. I also saw that the stories youth had about themselves were often their biggest impediment. For example, young people who dropped out of high school or got arrested were always taught that this was simply because of their poor choices. And surely there's some truth in that, but only in a worldview that isolates the individual as radically as ours could we reach the conclusion that anyone's life was only the product of personal choice. We are interconnected. Our stories are woven together. When an adolescent gets in trouble, the story is far more complex than individual choice. The individual is a web of relationships. A young person who drops out of school didn't choose an inequitable society, a dysfunctional family, or a failing school system. The high school dropout didn't choose that any more than we choose climate change, or the shrinking middle class, or coronavirus. But somehow we tend to blame those in the margins for their own marginalization. Sometimes we're less harsh about the actions of the richest and greediest among us who are causing so much destruction. We refer condescendingly to certain youth as at risk. But what of our at-risk planet, our at-risk species? Indeed, the notion that consumer choice would be a solution to climate change is based on this false premise, individualism. But not only is it not a solution, it's actually a major cause. We all need a new story, not just those in the margins. This isn't about blame. It's about a story that can help us find our place and recognize that we are not really alone. We are in this together on this single planet. In 2009, I moved to Chicago and started the Chicago Wisdom Project, a program to work with youth on the south side of Chicago. Over time, we developed a process that gave our young people the tools to reimagine their stories. This process isn't just healing for the participant, it also transforms the student into a teacher. The stories we tell offer new ways of seeing the world. That's why it's especially important that our stories come from multiple points of view, especially from those at the margins. There's a wisdom there that simply won't be found by those in the centers of power. From those who benefit from our current systems. But before we can begin to reimagine a story, it's helpful to return to lessons learned from an example of a learning space that is in many ways the opposite of the modern classrooms that promote the modern story of individualism. I'm talking about the one-room schoolhouse. To understand what that might be, we don't need to look at the curriculum. Rather, we need to imagine how the learning process would unfold in this space. Any classroom is a metaphor for the world. It can teach us that the world is hierarchical and rigidly ordered. It can teach us that the world is fluid, open, evolving. The classroom teaches us about our relationship to power, to our own agency, to our place in the community. In schools most of us attended in the United States, we learned that the world was something like the factories on which our public school system was modeled. We learned that we are essentially individuals competing with one another. This is the context in which the high school dropout is blamed for poor choices. But the one-room schoolhouse was a community. It had to be. The older students must teach the younger. Students and teachers must learn to get along. They were stuck with each other, entangled in this little world they could not escape. It is easy to conceive how we might fall in love with a small community that shares a history and a culture rooted in local ecology and shared stories. But our challenge now is planetary. The Earth is a lot bigger and more diverse than the one-room schoolhouse or an isolated culture that inhabits an island. But the Earth is also, in some ways, both schoolhouse and island. How can we tell a story that connects us on a planetary scale? The cosmology of a culture is expressed in the shape of a classroom. In a fascist state, control will be emphasized. In an industrialized state, there will be an increased emphasis on mechanized systems of education. In a techno-capitalist state, the emphasis will be on individual achievement. But upon what metaphors might the classroom of the world beyond coronavirus be based? We are clearly at a moment of both crisis and opportunity, a moment of apocalypse. Something new is emerging beyond the veil. The challenge with any new worldview is that our institutions still function based off the old cosmology. To explore the new context for what might be emerging, I will suggest the following 7 principles. The first is the concept of the holistic and cultivating planetary consciousness. So to understand what I mean here, we have to understand that a world, in the way I'm referring to it, is something that we construct culturally through our narratives and stories. It's what Greeks called cosmos. It's how we make sense and order and find our place in the world. Our world has really only consisted of small communities up until very recently in history. For the first time in human history, the entire planet must be our world. This is new, exciting, and scary. We are in this together, truly. Number 2 is depth. I'm suggesting that we've lost what I would call the textured world, lost its depth, because we're occupying sterile, two-dimensional spaces. We're looking at screens. We're moving from replicable corporate spaces from one to the next. Everything is sterile. Everything is air-conditioned. Everything is easy. But this impoverishes us and prevents us from really solving our problems. It reinforces the dichotomy of the inner and outer self, of the world and the self, and prevents us from seeing the subjectivity of the world. We tend to look away from that which makes us uncomfortable, from the suffering and sorrow that's part of life. And in doing so, we also miss out on the beauty and joy in the world. Number 3 is difference and diversity. We require both biological and cultural diversity to thrive. So when an ecosystem loses its diversity, it will collapse. Similarly, a lack of cultural diversity deprives us of the viewpoints that can allow us to find new solutions, new stories, different ways of fixing things. Just as in an ecosystem, genetic diversity or diversity of species can help in times of crisis. Number 4, ecology. This is about just simply moving from radical individualism to interconnection, thinking of ourselves as ecological beings, instead of thinking of ourselves as radically isolated consumers. Number 5, the power of circles, what I call social emotional justice. Just as the earth itself is not flat, rather it is a sphere, its systems function not as linear hierarchies, but as webs and circles of energy and wisdom. To learn how to function in such systems, we have to create non-hierarchical, justice-oriented spaces. In other words, if we hope to create a more just world, we must model this principle in our relationships, the ways we interact on a daily basis. This is where the true lessons come forth about how the kind of world we're seeking to create. Number 6, humility. Humility shares a root with the word humus, earth. We must think of ourselves not as not having all the answers. Indeed, our belief that we can engineer our way through everything has caused so much of the destruction of the planet. Moreover, effective communication and problem solving requires the humility of inquiry and dialogue, of asking questions and of listening. And number 7, wildness and play. Much of the destruction of the planet is the result of our tendency to destroy wild spaces, to pave them over. As we've done this, we've made our planet less healthy. We need the wild spaces. Moreover, we've also paved over the wildness within ourselves. The spirit of childhood in making and remaking worlds, exploration and curiosity in the absence of the limited thought patterns and assumptions that constrict us. Ours is an apocalyptic moment. I don't mean to be hyperbolic or to suggest that the physical world is actually ending. An apocalypse isn't the end of the cosmos, but the end of a cosmology, a system of stories and symbols that give us our place in the world. Much like the ancient Israelite culture in which the apocalyptic tradition arose, we are living in a time in which the old stories no longer give us a sense of place. In their time, the cosmopolitan Hellenistic culture was replacing the Israelite traditions, just as Gilgamesh had replaced the goddess tradition with patriarchy. In our age, we're confronted with a capitalist global culture that has unmoored us collectively, replacing the diverse tapestry of stories with a single story. And like the farming monocultures that threaten ecological health, social monocultures threaten human flourishing, soils and souls have grown sterile. What I've described as a classroom is the soil, the context in which new fruit can be brought forth. It isn't about literal classrooms in schools, but about the way we teach and learn together in any context. And the context must be, rather than isolated individuals, must be rooted in relationship, rather than in narrow, myopic concerns, in an awareness of our global interconnectivity. There is a single crisis, the disillusion of the cosmology of disconnection. As in all apocalypses, something new will emerge beyond the veil. Our choice now is between the emergence of the holistic, textured, multifarious, ecological, and playful world, or a regression into the fascism and superficiality of late capitalism. Thank you.